Midnight settled over Westbrook Township like a velvet curtain trimmed with frost, muffling the suburbs in a hush broken only by the distant click of sprinklers and the low-frequency hum of cargo trains threading their nightly path along the eastern commuter spur. Street lamps painted citrus halos on empty cul-de-sacs, and most windows glowed blue with slumbering televisions or not at all. But on Ivy Glen Drive, porch lights still burned outside a craftsman bungalow where Julia Marsh zipped her parka up to her chin and clipped a nylon leash to the collar of her restless Pitbull. Diesel normally slept sprawled across a memory foam slab by 10, but a cold front had stirred him into pacing loops, nose pressed to the mail slot. Ears flicking toward sounds Julia failed to parse. She tried cueing him to his bed twice, but the dog's amber eyes kept flicking toward the back gate as though gravity emanated there. Finally, conceding to his agitation, she muttered, "Okay, 5 minutes," and slipped into trail shoes. Leash in hand, they made it 3 houses down when Diesel stiffened, hackles lifting in a serrated ridge. The leash jerked, and before Julia could tighten her grasp, the metal clasp she'd inspected only days before snapped free. Diesel bolted, 20 meters of brindle muscle streaking under lamplight, skidding through a gap in a privet hedge that bordered the municipal easement leading to the rail line. Julia's adrenaline spiked. She vaulted the hedge, thorns raking her sleeve, and sprinted after him. The easement's soil was hard as poured cement, brittle weeds crunching underfoot. Ahead, Diesel's silhouette leapt across moon-silvered gravel, disappearing over a shallow embankment. Julia's lungs burned as she crested the rise and saw 2 steel rails gleaming in parallel ribbons under the half-moon. At first she spotted only Diesel, tail high, body angled sideways halfway down the track bed, but then her flashlight beam pinned something smaller just beyond him. A child, no more than 5, barefoot and pajama-clad, toddled along the outer rail as if balancing atop a curb, fine blonde hair plastered against a forehead damp with cold dew. The child's gaze was distant, unfocused, as though still half dreaming. Diesel planted himself between the rail and the child, barking in rapid staccato bursts. Each bark ricocheted down the night corridor like thrown stones. And then Julia heard it, the low, gathering rumble of a freight engine rounding the distant bend, a sound both subterranean and sky-wide. Heavy with the inevitability of engineered mass. Headlight cones sliced through tree crowns. Vapor pluming in silver columns. Reflex overrode panic. Julia crashed down the slope onto the ballast, shouting for Diesel, for help, for anything that might slice through the roar. But Diesel ignored her, pivoting so his body formed a barrier, barking with a ferocity that rewrote everything anyone in the neighborhood ever whispered about unpredictable pit bulls. Inside the locomotive cab a quarter-mile away, veteran engineer Marcus Delgado monitored gauges while junior engineer Tessa Singh scanned the track through reinforced glass. They'd traversed this spur hundreds of times. Deer sometimes darted. Teens occasionally staged late-night dares. But nothing prepared them for a split-second tableau of a dog, broad-chested, braced, illuminated by twin halogen beams, barking at something just beyond the light's reach. Tessa leaned forward, squinting, and her stomach plunged when the beams swept wider, revealing the small figure wobbling on a rail. "Child on track," she yelled. Marcus's hand slammed the emergency brake valve. Air hissed, steel screamed, and 4,000 tons of cargo began a protest that would carry on for 600 inexorable feet before true stillness. Horn blasts shattered the night, scattering roosting grackles. Sparks flared where wheels locked and kissed iron. Julia scooped the child just as Diesel retreated 2 bounds from the rail, the locomotive's metallic shriek blistering the air. She tumbled onto the gravel, shielding the child's head as the train ground nearer. Momentum bleeding but unstoppable. Diesel pivoted again, barking at the engine as though volume alone could erase physics. At last the monolith shuddered to a halt, sheer mass looming a mere 10 meters past where Diesel now stood. Chest heaving, silence, heavy and ringing, settled like ash. Diesel trotted back toward Julia, nose bumping her shoulder. She heard the child suck a breath. Then another, ragged but alive. Soft sobs bubbled as the child's fogged trance snapped. Julia's hands shook as she fumbled her phone from a pocket, dialing 911 with frozen fingers. Above, Marcus and Tessa clambered down a ladder. Rail shoes crunching gravel as they sprinted forward. Flashlights bobbing. Within minutes the easement blazed with emergency strobes, red, blue, white, painting the rails in chaotic pulses. Bodycam footage later obtained from first responders showed Diesel standing sentinel. Calm now. Tail swishing slow arcs as paramedics checked the child and Julia for injuries. One camera caught Marcus kneeling, wide-eyed, whispering, "If not for that dog," before voice cracking. Officers canvassed nearby backyards until a panicked mother burst from a side gate. Robe trailing, calling her son's name, she collapsed upon reaching the scene. Tears and apologies tumbling in equal measure. The child, Evan, age 4, had slipped through a broken slat in the fence during a sleepwalk. Feet carrying him toward the rhythmic ghost sound of nightly trains he often watched from his bedroom window. Media vans arrived by sunrise. But before headlines, before praise, Julia knelt among EMTs patching Diesel's scraped pads, hands buried in bristled fur. "You saved him," she whispered. Diesel leaned into her, closing his eyes, the adrenaline storm inside him finally receding. Hours later, rail line security cameras yielded crucial evidence, grainy footage of Evan padding across ballast. Diesel darting into frame, body angling to block the path, barking furiously. Another clip showed Julia sweeping the child into her arms as locomotive lights bloomed behind. Investigators pieced together a timeline that stretched barely 4 minutes yet spanned infinite futures spared. By noon, local papers ran an online teaser, "Midnight Miracle on Line 47, and social media churned out a new hashtag. #Diesel the Defender. Comment threads filled with surprise that the hero was a Pitbull, counter-narratives blossoming against years of breed stigma. Rail safety boards requested copies of locomotive cam footage for training modules titled, "Unexpected Hazard Recognition." Child safety advocates pitched PSAs on sleepwalking dangers. But for Julia, the world shrank to a living room couch where Diesel rested, bandaged paws propped on throw pillows. She draped a fleece blanket over him, tracing the curve of his ears, and thought about the moment the leash clasp snapped, how she'd cursed under her breath, until realizing the failure had been the first link in a chain that ended with a small heartbeat still drumming. Sometimes, she mused, hardware gives way so that instincts can do what metal never could. 3 days after the near miss on Line 47, clouds that had sulked low over Westbrook finally surrendered to early winter rain, turning every street lamp halo into a blurred watercolor bloom. Yet inside the Sanderson rail yard's maintenance hangar, fluorescent tubes pushed back the gloom in stark white stripes. Mechanics who usually tuned diesel engines wiped grease from their hands and lined up against the wall like shy spectators at a wedding. At center stage sat a hastily constructed podium, wood-grain laminate borrowed from the district council chamber and ferried over in a pickup truck that still smelled faintly of voter registration flyers. Julia stood off to one side, palms damp inside the pockets of a navy peacoat, watching the small throng gather. She had argued that a quiet thank you would suffice, that a dog didn't need flashbulbs or certificates. But Union Pacific's regional director insisted, company history had its share of tragedy, celebrating prevention. Especially at the jaws of a Pitbull. Felt like rebooting karma, so an official commendation ceremony unfurled amid torque wrenches and echoing rafters. Diesel, gauze pads now replaced by thin rubber booties, sat sphinx-like on a wool blanket. Someone had loaned him a reflective service dog vest for optics. But the Velcro strap hung loose beneath his chest. He was still Julia's rescue mutt beneath the neon safety stripes. He scanned the hangar with mild interest, nose cataloging scents of oil, ozone, and something musky from the break room burritos heating under foil in the corner. A hush spread as Regional Director Harold Blakely stepped to the mic. His beard, flecked with brake dust from touring the locomotive earlier, trembled when he cleared his throat. "Railroads," he began, voice carrying the rhythm of well-practiced speeches, "live and die by seconds. Steel can't pivot on a heartbeat. But instincts can." He told a clipped version of Midnight Events, spotlighting Tessa Singh's sharp eyes, Marcus Delgado's slam of the brake valve, and the brown brindled wall of fur that bought those seconds. Applause ricocheted off corrugated metal like hail. Diesel's ears flicked at the noise. But he stayed composed, golden eyes resting on Julia as if calibrating against her pulse. Blakely beckoned them forward, unveiling a plaque shaped like a rail spike with Diesel's name laser-etched beside a stylized locomotive. Julia accepted on the dog's behalf while a photographer snapped frames that would land on trade industry blogs within hours. Diesel received a specially minted tag emblazoned with the company logo and the words "Guardian of the Line." He sniffed the polished metal once, apparently unimpressed, then turned to greet Tessa Sane, who crouched and surrendered her palm. When Diesel licked her wrist, Tessa laughed, relief finally catching up to adrenaline deferred since break screech night. After handshakes, coffee urns hissed and Tupperware platters emerged. Diesel's booties click-clacked across the concrete as he followed Julia to a quiet corner. A safety officer slid him a slice of turkey, permission granted by public relations with a wink and plea for more photo ops. Julia lowered herself onto an overturned crate. Plaque balanced on her lap. She exhaled, letting shoulders dip. Diesel's head nudged under her palm. His breathing, slow and even, tethered her to the present, away from replay loops of metal shriek and moonlit rails. The next morning brought them to the modest office of Dr. Wendy Curran, a certified applied animal behaviorist whose waiting room smelled faintly of lavender diffusers and kibble samples. Bookshelves bowed under monographs on canine cognition, photographs of working dogs, Border Patrol Malinois mid-leap, Autism Assist labs curled around toddlers papered the walls. Dr. Curran greeted Diesel with the kind of quiet stillness dogs read as fluent respect. She offered no immediate touch, just knelt a meter away, letting the dog close distance on his terms. Diesel sniffed her notebook, then licked the rim of her boot. Permission granted. In the consultation suite, Dr. Curran asked Julia to recount every sensory detail she could. The pacing before the walk, the snap of the clasp, Diesel's trajectory and barking cadence. She took notes in shorthand arcs. Then she ran Diesel through a battery of assessment exercises. Startle recovery with dropped keys. Directional recall using muffled train horn recordings. A simulated toddler mannequin set near a portable speaker broadcasting shallow breathing. Diesel navigated each scenario with a measured vigilance, ears pricked, tail low but relaxed, gaze flicking to Julia for confirmation before acting. Dr. Curran's brow lifted incrementally, like a barometer needle rising. Afterward she summarized. Diesel displayed an uncommon blend of environmental sensitivity, social referencing, and impulse control. In plainer language, he noticed anomalies quickly, looked to Julia for cues. But if urgency outpaced human response, he self-deployed. That split-second judgment call, placing himself as a barrier, is protective aggression channeled through highly prosocial wiring. Curran explained, tapping the desk for emphasis. Julia half smiled at the term. Protective aggression sounded like an oxymoron, yet perfectly described Diesel's willingness to confront a threat not with teeth, but with presence. Curran recommended channeling Diesel's aptitude into formal search and rescue or rail safety canine work. Julia hesitated, her job managing a graphic design team already soaked evenings. But the idea of Diesel's gift sharpening through structured drills stirred something resolute. She scheduled an evaluation with Metro Search Alliance for the following month. Meanwhile, the buzz around the incident ignited civic action. Councilwoman Renee Alvarez, whose district encompassed Ivy Glen and the freight spur, seized momentum. She drafted a proposal for infrared trip beam fencing along suburban rail sections, citing Diesel's intervention as unreliable contingency humans don't deserve twice. At the first town hall meeting, Julia found herself beside an easel of blueprints. Diesel at her heel. Parents crowded the auditorium, some holding toddlers who squirmed like fledgling birds. A retired engineer argued costs. A high school student read a spoken-word poem about metal beasts and sleepless dogs. When public comment opened, Julia spoke last, unscripted. Diesel bought us grace. Let's not spend grace like a lottery win, once and gone. Applause erupted. Council voted 6-1 in favor of a pilot fence. Weeks shimmered by, December frost. Holiday lights. Then bare January wind. Diesel earned a bright orange SAR trainee vest. Attending weekend drills where instructors hid volunteers under brush piles while scent cones swirled in winter gusts. He worked systematically, nose to air, pausing every few yards to glance at Julia as though linking hearts by invisible filament. Each successful find earned exuberant praise and a rag-tug game that lit his eyes with puppy brightness. One brisk Saturday night, near the end of a moonless training session at Ridgewood Quarry, Diesel did something unexpected, tasked with locating a lost hiker decoy. He sprinted into Scrub Oak, then veered sharply downslope toward the disused service road paralleling the rail line. Handlers called after him, thinking he'd caught an errant deer scent. Julia trusted his instincts and followed, flashlight slicing darkness in jagged stripes. Diesel's bark echoed once, sharp, insistent. Julia crested a berm and froze. A sedan lay crumpled against a service road guardrail. Engine ticking, windshield cratered by a deflated airbag. The driver, a teen in a varsity soccer jacket, slumped half-conscious over the steering wheel. Phone at his feet flashing Uber directions that never completed. Diesel stood beside the passenger door, nose pressed to the window, barking rhythmic pulses. Julia radioed the training command post. Within minutes, first responders diverted from drill roleplay to real rescue. EMTs extracted the teen, minor rib fractures, concussion, early signs of shock. He'd skidded on black ice, unseen from the main road. Diesel's unscripted detour shaved precious minutes off the golden hour. News of a second life saved under different circumstances sealed Diesel's legacy beyond viral novelty. Local outlets ran dual banner segments. Midnight Rail Hero becomes certified search and rescue dog. Fundraisers for infrared fencing hit targets faster than city clerks could process payments. Rail companies matched donations, motivated partly by PR, partly by risk mitigation. The fencing project broke ground in early spring. Bright orange excavators lined the easement, driving posts that would anchor a nearly invisible grid of sensors. Diesel supervised from Julia's Jeep, head out the window, ears flapping in vernal breeze scented with thawing earth and railroad tar. Installation finished by June. On the inaugural test night, Councilwoman Alvarez organized a community picnic on a hill overlooking the tracks. Children darted between picnic blankets, parents hoisted sparklers. At 9:12 p.m., as scheduled, a freight engine rolled through, horn echoing mellow under stars. As its headlights swept the sensors, beams stayed green, no breach. The crowd cheered. Julia crouched beside Diesel, fingers threading through his ruff. He watched the train glide past, nose twitching at diesel fumes. But his posture stayed at ease. His mission tonight was observation, not intervention. 2 weeks later, a local news anchor closed the evening broadcast with a follow-up. Sensors had already prevented 3 trespass incidents, 2 neighborhood dogs and 1 elderly man with dementia who wandered from his care home. Rail dispatchers dispatched security within 90 seconds each time. Diesel's image flashed on screen wearing his SAR vest, framed by text that read, "From instinct to infrastructure." Life settled, not into dullness, but into sustainable rhythm. Diesel attended monthly SAR recertifications, lounged on Julia's patio between graphic design deadlines, and soaked up attention from neighbors who once eyed him warily. His favorite toy became a plush locomotive he carried from room to room. Julia printed a series of greeting cards featuring Diesel in various heroic poses. Proceeds funded SAR gear for canine newcomers. One autumn dawn, red sky, smell of distant rain. Julia woke to Diesel pacing. He paused at the bedroom window, stared toward the railway as if listening. Julia's phone buzzed moments later. Fencing alert near Sector B line inactive for maintenance but patrol requested. She glanced at Diesel. Volunteer shift? He wagged once, answer enough. They arrived at Sector B to find maintenance crews scrambling. A delivery drone, off course, had crash-landed near the track, igniting a brush fire that crawled toward timber sleepers doused in creosote. Diesel donned his vest, nose mapping smoke vectors. Julia grabbed a fire extinguisher from the Jeep. They split roles. She tackled small flames, Diesel circled, barking to herd onlookers away from sparks. Fire trucks soon roared in, hoses eclipsing the extinguisher's hiss. Command credited the quick citizen response with preventing a larger blaze that would have compromised the main fiber optic line running beside the rails. That night Julia updated Diesel's growing scrapbook. Rail rescue, car crash find, fire sentinel, 3 incidents, 3 domains, train, road, and flame, each intercepted by the same unassuming Pitbull once labeled, unadoptable, on shelter intake papers. The scrapbook's final page remained blank until the end of that year. When the township high school newspaper conducted an interview for a special edition on local heroes, the student journalist asked Julia how she defined Diesel's superpower. She paused, searching for vocabulary that wouldn't shrink the scope. Finally, she answered, "He notices edges where danger forms and fills them with presence before catastrophe can finish its thought." The phrase felt right, poetic yet precise. Diesel, sprawled nearby, sighed in what she imagined was agreement. On New Year's Eve, fireworks popped along Westbrook's horizon. Diesel, unfazed, trotted onto the porch, gazing at trails of color. Julia joined him, setting a mug of cocoa on the railing. The rail line beyond the backyard glinted under moonlight, now flanked by silent guardians, sensor posts blinking steady teal. Diesel watched a distant set of headlights glide. Safe and unremarkable, Julia laid a palm on his shoulder. "Nothing to chase tonight, buddy." Diesel leaned into her leg, warmth radiating through winter denim. They stood like that until the sky emptied of sparks. Until the velvet hush of Westbrook at 12:03 a.m. felt complete. Somewhere a freight horn sounded, low, content, and unhurried, as if grateful it had more than steel between its wheels and the vulnerable world. Grateful for eyes that saw in data and a nose that sensed in stories. Grateful for a Pitbull named Diesel who taught a town to close its gaps before fate could slip in. And so the scrapbook closed not with a dramatic finale but with an ordinary night made safer by extraordinary vigilance. A fitting epilogue for a dog whose heroism thrived in the quiet seconds where disaster once hunted but now found no invitation. The first soft snow of January drifted across Westbrook in fitful flurries, sugar dusting parked cars and blanketing the rail easement's new infrared posts with a powder so light it looked like candle smoke caught mid-exhale. Julia Marsh woke just past 5 to the hush that always accompanies snowfall, the world briefly muting its engine. From the foot of the bed, Diesel stretched, paws splaying, jaw parting in a yawn wide enough to squeak the plush locomotive clamped between his teeth. He dropped it at her feet like an offering, tail thudding a slow drumroll against the duvet. Most mornings that meant, sun's up, trail time, but Julia sensed something else in his posture, alert readiness without urgency. The way a lighthouse lamp keeps circling even on calm seas. Coffee brewed while dawn leaked pale gold over the backyard maples. Through the kitchen window Julia watched a single rail cart trundle north at reduced speed. Safety protocol for fresh snow. The teal sensor beacons shone through frost like tiny planets. And she felt that familiar swell, gratitude edging toward disbelief. That those silent guardians stood because her dog once shattered midnight stillness with a chorus of life-saving barks. The day's plan was simple. Drive to the county primary school where Principal Ellis had invited Diesel the Defender to headline Safety Week's assembly. Julia donned a forest green sweater, slipped a new Kevlar reinforced leash through its carabiner, and guided Diesel into the Jeep, heater already blasting away windshield ice. On the drive, NPR murmured a segment on rail technology upgrades nationwide. Julia smiled when a correspondent cited the Westbrook model of sensor installations. But she switched the dial when the host joked about hiring more super sniffer pups. Diesel's story had transcended novelty. She wanted listeners to understand that structural fixes and canine intuition now coexisted, each a necessary part of a mosaic. At Cloverleaf Elementary the gymnasium buzzed with pre-assembly chaos, sneakers squeaking, clipboard clutching teachers corralling lines, the scent of crayons and cafeteria cinnamon rolls mingling under high rafters. Diesel padded in with measured calm, nose tracing the peanut-free snack table before settling at Julia's heel near the folded bleachers. Students filed onto the hardwood floor, wide-eyed at the sight of a dog wearing a SAR vest patched with a tiny reflective locomotive. Principal Ellis, round-spectacled and radiating cheerful authority, stepped to the microphone and introduced our hometown hero who proves courage can have 4 paws and a wagging tail. Julia spoke sparingly. Kids wanted protagonists, not statistics. She painted the midnight scene, sleepy houses, a wandering child, the thunder of an unseen train. Diesel's head lifted at her change in vocal cadence, and dozens of young faces mirrored his intensity. Julia explained how instincts are tools we all carry, like a hero kid in our hearts, and that noticing small things, a friend too close to tracks, a gate left ajar, could be the superpower that changes everything. When she finished, Diesel performed a demonstration of his barrier sit, positioning himself between a rolling prop cart and a student volunteer. The gym erupted in applause that sprayed echoes off backboards. Afterward, kids swarmed in small groups, asking if Diesel could sniff out who had cookies in their lunchboxes. Julia laughed, directing them to hold their hands one at a time. Diesel offered polite sniffs, sitting when he found peanut-free chocolate chips. The moment served dual purpose: delight and subtle education on scent acuity. Driving home through snow globe flurries, Julia reflected on how each engagement, each retelling, slowly chipped at stone-old prejudice toward pitbulls. Numbers mattered for policy, but stories rewired hearts where regulation rarely reached. Diesel, snoozing in the passenger footwell, exhaled a breath that fogged the glovebox latch, unaware of culture shifts trailing him like contrails. 2 weeks later, an email arrived from the state governor's office. Diesel was to receive the Medal for Civilian Bravery, awarded annually to individuals whose spontaneous heroism preserved human life. Past recipients included ice rescue fishermen and a teacher who evacuated a burning bus. Never before had a dog been nominated, but the selection committee voted unanimously after reviewing locomotive cab footage. The ceremony was scheduled for February 20th at the Capitol Rotunda, a grand, marble-clad space beneath an Art Deco dome. Julia debated the symbolism. Would pomp overshadow purpose? But veterinary behaviorist Dr. Wendy Curran urged acceptance. Visibility is leverage. You never know which senator's heartstrings might fund another safety initiative. So Julia RSVP'd yes. Preparation consumed days. Tailor Melinda Ortiz volunteered to refit Diesel's vest with a blue satin lining and discreet loops for the metal ribbon. Julia's graphic design colleagues secretly produced a limited run of postage stamp-style pins. Diesel silhouetted against rail tracks with the motto "Presence before catastrophe." They sold out online in 24 hours. Proceeds bolstered SAR K9 gear statewide. Capitol Day dawned frigid, but sunlight poured through the dome's oculus like molten copper. Attendees filled semicircular galleries, lawmakers, rail executives, rescue volunteers, and families who'd written letters after the news story aired. Julia walked Diesel across marble in practiced heel, paws clicking a confident metronome. The ceremony flowed. Proclamations. A string quartet's rendition of "America the Beautiful." Speeches teetering between solemn and effusive. When Governor Reynolds bent to drape the medal around Diesel's neck, the dog pressed his forehead briefly against her blazer sleeve. Flashbulbs seized the gesture. By evening it would circulate social feeds captioned, "Canine Knighting." During the reception, Julia drifted to a quiet alcove, Diesel lying at her boots. A bespectacled woman approached, Railway Safety Board Chair Dr. Evelyn Grant. She thanked Julia and revealed that federal funding was earmarked for a pilot program layering canine patrols with AI-enabled smart fencing at rural junctions where wildlife and hikers often cross tracks. "Your dog," she said, voice soft yet fierce, turned a hypothetical into urgency. National attention invited scrutiny. A skeptic op-ed in the Tribune argued that glorifying a dog masked systemic gaps that still endangered trackside communities. Julia penned a response. "Diesel did not close the gate. He bought time for us to build one." The editorial board published it unedited, noting record reader engagement. By spring, Diesel's SAR certification advanced from provisional to full operational status. He received a call sign, Bravo Track 4, and a beeper code synced to Julia's phone. Their first deployment came sooner than expected. A multi-county search for a missing hiker last seen near River Bluffs paralleling the freight line 20 miles south. Command assigned Diesel to the flank team sweeping steep embankments where thermal drones struggled through dense leaf canopy. Evening shadows sliced the forest when Diesel's nose caught a scent vortex rising from below the ballast. He traced it to a drainage culvert, too narrow for humans but emitting faint exhalations tinged with laurel and damp wool. Diesel barked, short and clipped, then lay to indicate source. Julia alerted the rope rescue unit. They widened the culvert entrance and extracted a hypothermic but conscious woman wedged on a storm grate. Doctors said an hour longer inside 39-degree runoff water would have led to cardiac arrest. Local news missed the story, flood coverage dominated, but for the SAR community Diesel's alert became case study gold. Proof that rail-adjacent searches needed canine teams trained specifically for scent swirl amid creosote and iron. Summer arrived with cicada buzz. The sensor fence, tested over 6 months, logged 0 false positives and intercepted 5 genuine incursions, 2 sleepwalking incidents. 1 suicidal attempt thwarted when command dispatched a mental health team, and 2 deer herds diverted back toward the river woods. Data convinced federal transit authorities to grant Westbrook a showcase slot at the National Rail Safety Summit. Julia, feeling her public speaker muscles strengthen, traveled to Chicago with Diesel. The summit's expo hall glittered with maglev prototypes and augmented reality conductor helmets. Yet Diesel drew crowds. A high-speed rail engineer admitted he'd scoffed at sentimental safety until reviewing sensor logs paired with canine alert timestamps. Our algorithms still can't parse breathing, he conceded. Maybe the future is both silicone and synapse. Back home, Julia and Diesel resumed quieter rituals, morning runs along the Riverside Trail. Lazy afternoons in the shade of maple groves where Diesel snoozed nose deep in clover. Yet every time a freight horn moaned across dusk, Diesel's ears still pivoted, calibrating distance but rarely rising from rest. He trusted the fence. The reform, the new guardrails of human diligence he'd sparked. On the first anniversary of the midnight near Miss Westbrook held a lantern vigil at Ivy Glen Park. Rail line a silver thread beyond chain link. Families placed LED candles along the fence base, children tied paper locomotives to posts. Each inscribed with pledges like, "I will lock the gate," or, "I will look both ways." Julia spoke briefly, voice carrying under star-pricked sky. "Tonight we honor the seconds we almost lost. The seconds Diesel gave back. Let's spend them wisely." She unclipped his leash, and Diesel trotted along the fence. Tail steady, nose brushing lantern glow. A living blessing. As candles flickered, Evan, the once wandering child, now 5 and brimming with curious energy, approached Diesel clutching a stuffed dog that looked suspiciously brindle. "Thank you for saving me," he whispered, pressing fabric paws to Diesel's real ones. Diesel licked frosting from the boy's cheek. A simple benediction. Julia's chest tightened. No accolade matched this. Seasons turned again. Diesel's muzzle frosted gray by the following year. But his gait retained elasticity. And veterinarian checkups praised heartbeats strong as locomotive pistons. Julia accepted fewer public engagements, focusing instead on mentoring new SAR handler teams. She developed a digital course titled Edge Sensing Canine Protocols, weaving video of Diesel's alerts with interactive simulations. Enrollment filled faster than server capacity. Railside communities from Alaska to Maine integrated modules into volunteer rescue academies. When Diesel reached 10, Julia scheduled a retirement recognition at the annual SAR banquet. She feared pomp might feel hollow. But Diesel trotted onto the stage, bandana fluttering, and seemed to bow at the standing ovation. Leaning into his moment before settling at her feet, she announced that Bravo Track 4 would transition to Youth Education Ambassador, teaching children rail respect and scent ecology. The banquet hall erupted in approval. Years later, long after Diesel's final gentle sigh beneath twilight maple branches, Julia's courseware evolved into a nonprofit foundation, Presence Before Catastrophe. Its logo preserved his silhouette mid-bark. Eternal Sentinel. Rail companies donated sensor tech to under-resourced regions. SAR units named their K9 cohorts Bravo Track in homage. Somewhere, in hushed midnight neighborhoods, dogs lifted heads at distant horns, and railside lights blinked teal, and catastrophes measured their odds against the quiet wall of vigilance a single Pitbull had built one winter night. And in Westbrook, if you stand by Ivy Glen Drive at midnight and listen closely, freight wheels still hiss over steel, but residents swear they hear another note, softer, rhythmic, like a heartbeat woven into track noise. The echo of Diesel's bark carrying forward, forever reminding the town how presence became ballast, how instinct bought time. How a life once poised on rails reclaimed its tomorrow because a restless dog chose not to ignore the pull of danger just beyond the porch light's edge. 5 winters after Diesel's lantern vigil, the maple that shaded his favorite corner of Ivy Glen Park stood taller. Trunk thickening in slow spirals that gardeners call memory rings. Squirrels still hid acorns under the bench engraved with his name. And small children, most too young to recall the midnight miracle, would pause their scooter races just long enough to pat the bronze paw that jutted from the statue's base. As if trading a secret handshake with a guardian they trusted by instinct. On a wind-nipped February morning, Julia Marsh parked her now aging Jeep beside that bench and slid out carrying a manila envelope stamped with the Department of Transportation seal. Snowmelt trickled through grass still wearing last autumn's freckles. She sat, letting gloved fingers trace the cold metal silhouette of Diesel mid-bark. Inside the envelope lay final approval. Presents before catastrophe had been awarded a multi-million-dollar federal contract to integrate canine scent assessment with eye-powered acoustic arrays at rural crossings nationwide. For Julia, victory felt less like confetti and more like a deep exhale. The kind you take when a train finally clears the crossing and the rails fall silent again. She opened the envelope and read the letter once more, hearing Diesel's old breathing in memory. The project would pair dogs from shelters, preferably those flagged high drive, high empathy, with sensor packages small enough to clip onto harnesses. When a dog indicated abnormal scent, ethanol, acetone, stress pheromones, the harness would blast a data packet through low-orbit satellite to the nearest dispatch center. Where fences were impossible, vigilance would travel on 4 paws and in kilobits per second. Julia whispered, "We did it, buddy," and imagined a tail thumping against celestial floorboards. That afternoon she drove west, snow giving way to rolling fields the color of cream-crusted coffee. At the newly built Diesel Carter Training Center, a low, cedar-clad lodge hugging the edge of a dormant quarry, 25 dogs practiced edge-sensing drills. There were shepherd mixes and terrier crosses, a lanky hound with ears that flapped like banners, and a block-headed mutt named Meridian whose brindle patches near perfectly echoed Diesel's coat though she shared none of his blood. Trainers had learned to speak softly here. Whistles were swapped for whispered cues because the program valued perception over volume. Julia met with lead instructor Rowan Cho, once the teenager Diesel had found in a wrecked sedan. Now a calm-eyed adult with a doctorate in behavioral neuroscience. Rowan's research had just mapped a cluster of olfactory receptor genes shared among high-performing alert dogs. She believed shelters could soon cheek swab intakes and predict potential, trimming training costs and sparing animals from languishing in kennels where their instincts soured into anxiety. They walked the inner track where magnetic sensors simulated rail vibrations. At Station 4, Meridian froze, nostrils flaring. A trainer placed a jar of diluted ethyl mercaptan, the odorant used in natural gas leaks, beneath a grate. Meridian angled her body between the grate and the dummy toddler planted nearby. Then executed a crisp bark sit. Rowan glanced at her tablet. Half a second faster than last week. Within Diesel's famed metric, she murmured, "Presence before catastrophe," and clicked treat dispenser. That night Julia sat at a long pine table drafting curriculum for the first National Edge Sensing Symposium. Invitations would go to railway execs, rural mayors, and legacy dog training guilds still skeptical of merging fur with firmware. She framed the keynote not around Diesel's heroics, too easy for skeptics to call anecdote, but around data arcs bending downward, emergency call-outs, pediatric rail deaths, property damage from trespass collisions. Each dip in the graph corresponded to a county where canine sensor hybrids now patrolled. March thaw bloomed into April rains. And with the rains came an unexpected test. 50 miles east, a spring break party spilled onto disused tracks behind an abandoned granary. Bonfires flickered, music thumped, and a gust whipped embers into dead switchgrass. Someone scattered beer to douse sparks, unaware the granary still bled pockets of grain dust. Dry as moon rock yet explosive. Remote acoustic monitors flagged unusual clap patterns, cross-checked with heat signatures. But the nearest fire crew was 20 minutes out. Meridian and Rowan were running twilight drills when dispatch pinged the caller unit. potential grass fire plus unconfirmed trespass. They loaded into a van with 2 firefighters from the on-site rotation and sped through rain pooling on rutted gravel. Arriving, they found a crescent of flame marching toward the granary wall and a handful of teens swaying between fear and tipsy bravado. Meridian leapt from the van before Rowan even unhooked her leash. Nose slicing wet air, ears pinned, she darted left, barked 3 times, then lay down near a shrub patch that appeared unburned. Rowan sprinted after, flashlight revealing a prone figure half hidden by tall weeds, one of the partygoers. Ankle twisted, unconscious from smoke, fire crews hacked a line in tall grass. By the time county engines roared in, the blaze was contained. The injured teen oxygenated and loaded into an ambulance. Meridian returned, muzzle singed with soot but tail flowing high. A sheriff's deputy asked Rowan how the dog chose the casualty amid chaos. Rowan shrugged, half grin. She noticed edges where danger forms. Media coverage framed it as déjà vu, another brindle Pitbull mix intervening on tracks. But commentators added nuance, this time a trained professional in a network of sensors. Diesel's legacy had matured. 3 months later, Julia received news that the mother of Evan, the child Diesel had first saved, had joined the Presence Before Catastrophe board. She brought insight from pediatric sleep clinics, advocating that the foundation fund smart lock kits for families with sleepwalking kids living near rights-of-way. The pilot launched quietly. Within 6 weeks, 2 incidents were averted when locks beeped parents awake before doors swung open. Julia's phone wallpaper remained the photo of Diesel licking frosting off Evan's cheek at the lantern vigil. One humid July evening, she tapped that image and whispered, "You keep rippling." It felt like a prayer and a promise. On the 5th anniversary of Diesel's medal ceremony, the governor's office sent an invitation for Julia to speak again, this time to announce statewide completion of sensor-installed corridors. She accepted, but asked that Meridian and Rowan accompany her. During the press conference, Julia stepped back as Meridian performed a live detection, sniffing a dummy bag with contraband lithium batteries hidden beneath packing foam. When the dog paw tapped the case and sat, reporters gasped. Even seasoned railway officials exchanged impressed looks. Batteries posed thermal risks on freight lines. After the conference, a senior infrastructure advisor confided that momentum was building for a federal funding package to retrofit all Class 1 freight corridors with integrated safety ecosystems, sensors, canine teams, community education. He winked. "We'll call it the Diesel Clause." That September, Julia drove east, coasting coastal highways slick with salt air, to deliver a guest lecture at the Naval Academy's Emerging Threats Seminar. Cadets in starched whites took copious notes as she described odor plumes around hazardous material trains. How wind gusts bounced them like invisible trampolines. She ended with a short video montage, Diesel barking in moonlight, Meridian lying beside a rail, children patting Bronze Paw. The auditorium rose in applause. One cadet later emailed her, saying he'd thought dogs were relegated to morale roles, but now considered them strategic assets. Winter returned, not with tragedy but with snowfall so thick it hushed every branch. On New Year's Eve in Ivy Glen, lanterns glowed again, though this time children recited sensor installation stats between songs. Julia glanced at the plaque near Diesel's bench. New etchings listed zeros, 0 pedestrian fatalities, 0 train trespass collisions, years since the fence went live. She ran a mitten over the numbers. Clearing fresh snow, letting cold bite through wool as a reminder that comfort comes after vigilance. Not before. Rowan approached with Meridian, who sniffed Diesel's bronze paw then rested her chin on Julia's knee. Fireworks burst over downtown. Meridian's ears flicked but stayed level. Rowan murmured, "Edge secure." Julia smiled, Diesel's line still held. Later, strolling home, Julia passed a mural newly painted on an underpass wall. A rolling wave of railway ties morphing into a dog's silhouette. Tide of steel becoming muscle and fur. Beneath it a caption read, "Where metal ends, heart begins." She snapped a photo, sending it to the Presence Before Catastrophe board with a single line, "Keep noticing the edges." Far beyond Westbrook, in desert freight depots and fog-bound mountain passes, new dogs tilted their heads at distant horns. Harness LEDs blinking like distant stars synced to hidden satellites. Each carried Diesel's principle stitched into nylon, presence before catastrophe. Each had a handler ready to translate bark into action. And somewhere beyond calculations of cost-benefit analyses and risk matrices, a late-night traveler exhaled an oblivious breath that would never know its own peril. Saved by a nose attuned to thresholds humans still struggle to name. Julia, back at her house, placed the envelope with the federal contract beside Diesel's first bandana. Pumpkin print faded to ghost orange. She whispered thanks to whatever alignment of chance and instinct had gifted the world one restless Pitbull who broke into night. Barking edges into focus. Outside, snow fell in tiny gleaming prisms, each flake a quiet chime hitting rails. The trains kept running, horns low and unhurried, as if confident the path ahead was watched by eyes seen and unseen. Four-footed sentinels guarding the liminal space where catastrophe once waited, now closed for good. An amber dusk the color of dulled brass folded itself over Westbrook on the eve of the 15th anniversary of the Midnight Rail Rescue, an evening poised between seasons. When dogwoods still held a few blossoms yet crickets had already tuned up for summer. Julia Marsh, now silver-streaked at the temples but still possessed of the runner's grace Diesel had taught her, left the office of presence before catastrophe earlier than usual. Motion sensor lights dimmed behind her, revealing clean sightlines through glass partitions where younger staff drafted international standards that would soon require edge-sensing canine teams on every Class 1 line in the contiguous United States. She carried a slim box wrapped in railway map paper. Inside rested a single bronze key, ornate bow cast in the shape of a dog's head, bit filed to fit the gate of the newest Diesel-class training campus soon to open in Melbourne. The Australian government had licensed the entire model, sensor arrays, genetic screening swabs, and most importantly, the philosophy that still centered one simple dog. Julia would fly out in 2 weeks to unlock the gate. But tonight she walked toward Ivy Glen Bench, the ritual untouched by time or acclaim, because anniversaries belong to the quiet hours before speeches gild them. Ivy Glen Park looked changed and unchanged. The maples were monstrous now, limbs thick enough to cradle rope swings, but their arrangement still framed a perfect view of the rail easement. The bronze Diesel statue wore a soft patina, nose polished anew by generations of small hands. Julia set the map-wrapped box beside his paws and settled onto the bench. She could feel the vibration of an approaching freight, a low roll, comforting the way a heartbeat comforts an infant. Beyond the chain link, teal sensor lights winked in rolling succession as the train passed, acknowledging its presence to the invisible grid. No alarms, tracks clear, edge secure. The little phrase had become so ubiquitous railway dispatchers clipped it to S in shift logs. Diesel's ghostly initials, Julia mused. She closed her eyes, letting the diesel and ozone tang wake memory, the bark ricocheting off steel. The squeal of brakes. The wait time had dilated that night until every second felt thick enough to sculpt. Those seconds had multiplied, fractal-like, spawning fences, research labs, scholarships, and above all, lives, tens of thousands of them if actuarial projections were right, saved from disaster that never materialized. Catastrophe, starved of opportunity, had migrated elsewhere. A soft tread on gravel pulled Julia back. Rowan Cho approached, Meridian padding beside her, muzzle whitened now, but posture still alert. In the leash-free darkness, Meridian had learned Diesel's trick of scanning rails without tension, as if her gaze alone could iron out threats. Rowan carried a tablet glowing faint blue. "Thought you might be here," Rowan said, sitting on the bench arm. She tilted the screen toward Julia. Global dashboard statistics. 0 rail trespass child fatalities in 5 consecutive years across all monitored corridors on 4 continents. Julia exhaled, the numbers singing louder than crowds. They sat in companionable hush while the freight's red marker lights dwindled south. When silence returned, Julia lifted the map-wrapped box. "For Melbourne," she said. Rowan traced the embossing. Diesel would have loved chasing cockatoos. They laughed, picturing a brindle blur against southern skies. Rowan produced a second package, thin, hardbound. The cover bore an illustration of a moonlit track and a dog silhouetted against locomotive lights. Title: Where Metal Ends, Heart Begins. The Diesel Doctrine for Young Guardians. A children's book, jointly authored by Rowan and Principal Ellis's granddaughter. Now a junior editor at a New York publishing house. Proceeds would endow a therapy dog literacy program. Julia flipped pages. Watercolor spreads glowed with soft indigos and russets. The last page showed a child placing a lantern at a statue's paw beneath stars that spelled the word listen. Tears blurred the ink. He keeps finding new jobs. Julia whispered, heroes are restless. Rowan answered. A breeze rustled the bench leaflet. Julia leaned back, feeling a weight slide off shoulders she hadn't realized were tense. I think, she said slowly, I'm ready to let him belong to the world completely. Rowan nodded. Legacy isn't something we hold, it's something that carries us. Meridian laid her head on Julia's knee. And in that simple pressure Julia felt both goodbye and continuum. Headlights flashed at the park entrance. A campus shuttle converted to electric routing kids to the evening vigil rehearsal. Dozens of middle schoolers piled out holding paper track lanterns for a procession across Ivy Glen footbridge. Their teacher corralled them toward the sensor fence where they would weave the lanterns through chain link in letters spelling PB4C, the foundation's shorthand. A boy broke formation, approached the statue, and touched the bronze ear. My grandma says he barked the train to a stop. He said. Julia replied. He barked so we could keep listening. The boy smiled, returned to his cohort, and the lantern parade floated like a constellation in mid-assembly. Rowan checked her watch. Symposium livestream in 30, she reminded. They stood, brushing snow crystals, and walked toward the community hall where Julia would broadcast a keynote across time zones, Westbrook to Melbourne, Toronto to Johannesburg. Meridian trotted ahead, tail cutting arcs through lamplight. At the hall's podium Julia glanced at the back row. The bronze key had been taped above the exit sign, orientation for tomorrow's flight. Beside the camera rig, an intern cued opening graphics, diesel silhouette merging with a world map glowing in edge-secure teal. Julia adjusted the lapel mic. Pulse serene. She spoke not of milestones, but of trajectories. The vector from one snapped leash clasped to sensors embedded in satellite-linked harnesses. She described edges as living things, reachable only when communities believed vigilance was not a burden but an act of shared artistry. She ended with a challenge to the next generation: find new edges. Bring new dogs. Translate new silences. When the stream faded, applause filled the hall and spilled into hallways where poster sessions buzzed. Julia exhaled. Meridian nudged her hand, asking perhaps for a walk under the lantern glow before snow thickened. Julia obliged. They stepped outside into gentle flurries. Rowan following. At the statue, lantern letters now formed a perfect PB4C. Snow sifted across bronze shoulders. Julia placed a palm on cold metal. Edge secure, she said softly. A train horn floated from beyond the trees, distant. Measured. Easy. Meridian looked toward the sound. Ears up but relaxed. Then pressed her nose to the plaque, as if stamping her own acknowledgement. Snow thickened, softening footfalls into silence. Lights from the hall cast long shadows, one of a woman, one of a dog, and one bronze frozen mid-bark, stretching across fresh powder toward the tracks. Together those shadows reached the rail's boundary and faded into white, leaving the park wrapped in quiet presence, the kind that hovers just before catastrophe and keeps it forever at bay. Far down the line teal beacons winked, unseen but certain. And somewhere a child slept behind a locked gate. A conductor eased the throttle knowing sensors and snouts patrolled the night. And a restless dog in another town pricked her ears at the distant hum of steel, ready to notice the next edge the moment it formed.